Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors around the world, academics, scholars, activists, reporters, columnists, writers, anybody who's involved in politics and can speak intelligently about political polarization or the state of politics in America today, troubled or good. We want to provide perspectives, uncut and unedited, directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it won't. With us today, it is our honor to have Leonie, Huddy, Department Chair of Political Science at Stony Brook University. She's also in Australia now. She's a native Australian, but she does teach at Stony Brook University in America. She's a professor of political science at State University of New York at Stony Brook. She studies political behavior in the United States and elsewhere through the lens of intergroup relations, with a special focus on gender, race, and ethnic relations. Her recent work extends that focus to the study of partisan identities in the United States and Western Europe. She is co-editor of the second edition of the Oxford Handbook of Political Psychology, served as co-editor of the Journal of Political Psychology from 2005 to 2010. It's past president of the International Society of Political Psychology, serves on the American National Election Studies Board of Overseers, appears regularly on CSB radio as an exit poll analyst, serves on numerous editorial boards in political science. She's also written extensively on social and political identities, emotions, reactions to terrorism, gender, politics, and race relations. She's the co-author of Going to War to Iraq When Citizens and the Press Matter. Yeah, that was an interesting thing. I might ask you about that. She's teaching social surveys in contemporary society, survey research, passionate politics, social influence, and group possessions in political decision-making. She studies political behavior in the United States and elsewhere through the lens of intergroup relations. And she's also worked on political politics for the US and Western Europe. This is some of the things that she was associated with. Cuomo scandal tests the limits of Me Too as he resists resignation. The London School of Economics and Political Science blog. That's a very prestigious one. Department Chair Leonie Huddy, researchers featured in Behavioral Scientist Research Lead, also on partisanship and voting behavior, also talking to CNBC on why people don't vote, and also quoted recently in the American Psychological Association article on fear and voting behavior. But this is how I found her. Expressive partisanship, campaign involvement, political emotion, and partisan identity, along with Liliana Mason. But before we get to that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I make any mistakes? Is there something I need to correct? Did I say anything wrong?
I think that sounds pretty good. Just to underscore, I'm a political psychologist. So the one thing maybe you could add is that I'm really trained as a psychologist and have extended that understanding to the study of political science. So my career has been in political science, but I have a deeper training in psychology. So it turns out to be really interesting to apply that lens to people's political attitudes and behavior.
I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's very perfect now, because I don't, from the research I've been doing on political polarization, I think if you go back maybe 50 years ago, it might have been kind of a dry subject. People vote based upon what the issues of the day are. But everything in the last 15 years seems to suggest that people are moving away from even caring about policies and more being concerned about their identity. Their political party, their voting reflects their identity, and that's really important to them. And that's a psychological factor. That's not a political factor. Is that roughly seems accurate?
I mean, it's so interesting. Back in the 1970s, the political scientists were saying, well, partisanship is over. It's dead. Americans are not very partisan. They don't really care about the political parties. And that's changed so dramatically in the last decade or so, where these partisan identities have become paramount. It's not, and I would add that it's not entirely devoid of policy. Some of what's been happening is that people have been sorting more completely into the political parties, so that we're getting sorting on religious lines, race and ethnicity, and other kinds of fundamental beliefs. It may not be specific policies, but there is an overall identity that goes along with other aspects of a person's life and self. So it's wrong to say that there's no policy. It's not exactly what we think of as traditional economic ideology, I think is the best way to describe it.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'd seen that, and the classic stories of there used to be liberal Republicans, there used to be conservative Democrats. I was
Right.
looking up the story of, I think Joe Lieberman was the last conservative Democrat, or at least the last big one to be taken down. And when he got taken down, it was just because the Democrats just didn't want to associate with him anymore. You know, the climate had shifted. I don't care that you've been a lifelong Democrat. You look bad for us now. It hurts our brand. Another way of saying brand psychologically, identity. And then now, like you said, they're sorted. All hardcore Republicans, all hardcore Democrats, and maybe this group in the middle. And it used to be you couldn't tell if somebody listened to country music or waved the American flag or worked at a metal shop, what party they voted for. And now it seems almost like you can look at almost any demographic or social characteristic and you can go, I bet that person's a Democrat or Republican, and you'd probably be right most of the time. Is that roughly accurate of what's going on?
I mean, it extends into lifestyle choices, the music that you listen to, the books that you read, the TV shows that you watch. It really is extraordinary. And I think you're right that you can really tell these things are really lining up. It's not just your political attitudes, it's the way you live life, the type of car that you drive, whether you're worried about climate change and do certain things, eat meat, don't eat meat, all of these things have become more politicized. But I should add that, I think you're right, Max, when you said there are also people who are sort of in the middle. So we hear a lot from our political extremes. By some estimates, 10% of people make 90% or more of the noise on social media. So we're hearing from a very dedicated subset on both sides. And there still are people who either could not care less about politics. Just remember that in any presidential election, we have, upwards of a third of people who simply don't get involved. They don't vote, they don't pay any attention to it. And then we have other people who are sort of vaguely paying attention. So we have to keep that in mind, that while we are pretty divided, some people are much more so than others.
I've heard that. I've heard that. I've heard people say, well, there is polarization, but it's really at the extremes, the extreme left and the extreme right. And those people are way more motivated. They donate more, they volunteer more, they get involved more, they vote more, they show up to the primaries. So they're really the ones pushing us apart. And I said, well, okay, maybe, but a couple factors. There was this group called the Irish Republican Army, and they kept something called the Troubles in Ireland going for about 20 to 30 years. Couldn't make it work. People shot in the streets. That was no more than 2% of the population, supported by about 15%. So only 2% was actually shooting and getting involved. But then you had about 15% who were sympathetic. And then you had about another 30% who were sort of quasi-sympathetic. I'm not really going to do anything, but I might occasionally say, yeah, IRA one day. And that was enough to keep it going 20, 30 years. We look at ISIS. Same thing in Iraq. It was only about 2% of the population, supported by 15% of the Sunnis and then 30%. So we also can look at the American Revolution. It was actually an American secession movement. Americans don't like to hear that, but it was a secession movement. People outside of America know that. Americans don't know that. It's only about 2%. So I get that we have these fringes, but when we look back in history, a tiny percentage of the population was able to force the entire population into a war and change the total trajectory of their political history. Fair analysis or not?
I mean, there's no question that these extremes can create a great deal of trouble. I mean, there is absolutely no question. And it's also the case. I mean, I'm just saying that so that people understand when they meet another person, not everyone wants to have this kind of conversation. Some people are quite averse to addressing these sorts of political issues, but that doesn't mean that it isn't problematic or has influence over our society. So it's more just to understand. And I think when you have these extremes, people feel that they have to take a side,
Right.
right? So that in the last analysis, if it really comes down to a civil war, it's hard to remain neutral. So I think there's also that sense that when push comes to shove, people will pick sides. When they pick those sides, as we can see, if we look at public opinion data, maybe 15% of Americans say they have absolutely no attachment to Republicans or Democrats. But that leaves 85% of people who do. And then they vary in how strongly they're identified with those sides. But that means about 85% of our population is sorted. I mean, they've picked a side.
80, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
85. So
85%?
15% of Americans are in the middle, basically with no preference between Democrats and Republicans.
85% are sorted. Is that?
Yep.
And
Yep.
15% are unsorted.
Yep.
So when they go, hey, we're going to win this election by the moderates and the undecided, they're talking about this many voters left to determine whether the country.
15% can be quite influential in a close election, as we know, right? If you can win over your 15%, you've got that election made, because we know the Democrats and Republicans are largely going to vote for their side.
I've heard that people are focusing mostly on their base. I read something the other day that was saying, well, political polarization really got started with Obama's second term because he focused on reaching out to the base in order to activate them to win. He didn't focus on reaching to the middle. And then Trump, wow, that was even worse. But I was amazed to see, hold on, Obama? I thought he was the moderate, the one that brought us all together. And you go, well, yeah, that's how he talked. And generally, he did say, we're all Americans. I want us all together. And he really did try to push that. But when push came to shove, and it was time to win a re-election or lose a re-election, he focused primarily on motivating his base instead of appearing to the moderate center. Is that fair, or does that seem wild?
I would go further back. I don't. It's not just Obama. If we look at these data, the sorting really began in the 90s. I'd say Bill Clinton. We start to see a sea change and some of that is lifestyle related. It wasn't complete, but that's when we start to see a shift with the decline of conservative Democrats and a decline in liberal Republicans. So it's been going on for quite some time. We can say each president, maybe there was some intensification with each successive president after that. George W. Bush, let's say this, the Iraq War, and I wrote about that, was very polarizing. It was very polarizing. So this intensified this dislike of the other side. People felt that they were morally correct. Whichever side you were on the right side. Obama comes along, there's a further intensification of that, and then this happens again further with Donald Trump. So it has been going on for longer than just the 2000s. I think if we trace it back, we can start to see this rift in the early 90s. And remember, there were some culture war discussions at that time. Bill Clinton was, remember, Bill Clinton was accused of pot smoking. So people started to crystallize these ideas of what liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats were like. These lifestyle factors started to creep in. And we're seeing a greater role of religion inside the Republican Party. That's intensified over time with an intensification of evangelical Christians inside the Republican Party. So it's multiple factors, I think. I don't think we can point to any one thing. It's been rolling for a while.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that, because I'm in California, and most of our professors, most of our lawyers, most of our elected officials, most of the educated public say, we lived in a state of nature. Perfect. And then Trump came and he single-handedly destroyed everything and brought racism to America. I can't tell you how many people went on TV with titles underneath their name and said that. And nobody has contradicted them today in California. Nobody's ever walked that back. Nobody's ever said, well, on second thought, looking more into it, that was kind of a surface analysis. He's still the worst thing ever. And the moment he's locked up in jail, poof, America goes back to work.
No, yeah, it's such a wrong analysis. I mean, this has been going on for some time. I mean, one of my colleagues studies authoritarianism. And these are questions that are asked of ordinary people, which are basically, it's about tradition versus change and creativity. You know, the questions are very simple about what values parents should convey to children. And the sorting has also been along those lines. People who value tradition and more conservative ways of doing things have intensified their presence in the Republican Party. So they used to also be in the Democratic Party. So if we look at a whole multiple set of factors, we just see this increased sorting along many, many lines. Attitudes, the type of person that you are in terms of race, ethnicity, or religious beliefs, it didn't start with Trump. I mean, Trump, what I would say is that the Republican Party was ready for Trump when he showed up.
Thank you. So
Yeah.
that's the
That's, I think,
impression.
the best way to describe it,
Well,
that they had
that's
been
how
sorting for some time.
yeah, that's how I thought it was, that Trump came in and I'm not a fan of Trump. I have talked to many people who voted for them, and I treat him with respect when I interviewed them. But to me, the man's a racist. He made my mom cry. She's Mexican. So we're never going to get along ever. Yes, he said Mexicans are rapists. I can debate for 18 hours with anybody who ever wants to pull it. I did that with a January 6th person and shut him down hard. Happy to do so. But I think you're right that, if we went back to 2000 and Trump ran and he was trying to be as divisive, I don't think it would have worked. I think the ground was seeded for him. And then he came and he was right. The soil's right. The composition's right. The moisture's right. The fertile. And now this wicked plant's ready to grow. And I love the fact that you brought up, well, hold on. Let's look at W. Bush. He was polarizing. And I just got done reading something by Abramowitz that was showing how Bush's first term, pretty mundane. We're all Americans. Yeah, he was pushing conservatism, but he was trying to, all America. But his second term, oh my God, 80% of Democrats hate him. 85% of Republicans love him. And you're like, so you already see this massive.
Oh, it was incredible. It really was incredible. The intensified dislike across those lines. You can see the graphs over time that track progress or lack of in the Iraq War. And it just, I think people were shocked at that time. Can't get any worse. That was the idea, that we are so polarized. How could it get any worse around a president, with Democrats all saying this is the worst president ever, Republicans saying this is the best president ever? It did get worse. It got worse, but it wasn't great. It wasn't great then. And one thing that I will say about that time period, in some of my other work, I study nationalism. This is the kind of thing that Donald Trump talks about when he speaks about America first. There's been a rise in nationalism, nationalistic politics in Europe as well as in the US and other places. But it looks to me like, looking at the data, again, looking at surveys over time, that it was following 9/11 that we start to see a rise of nationalistic support for the Republican Party. So looking at the same set of attitudes, I would describe nationalism in this case as what we would call a chauvinistic support of the nation. That nation is better than all of the others. It isn't patriotism. I would define as simply love of country. And this is distinct from that. It goes with it, but it's a particular type of attitude.
Right.
And that has grown following the events of 9/11. We really see that with the policies that came about then, American intervention in places like Iraq, that appealed to people with nationalistic sentiments, and they have also moved towards the Republican Party starting in the 90s.
I remember the phrase, if you're not with us, you're against us. I remember the phrase, America, right or wrong, used massively with the Iraq. And I'm like, what do you mean, America, right or wrong? So if we start doing a Holocaust, I have to go, oh, I'm on board because I'm an American. And nobody was thinking about that. They go, no, just America, it just means, fight against terrorism. I'm like, no, think about what you're saying. Nobody did. America, right or wrong?
And it's not like, it's interesting because we can see the sorting along nationalistic lines. I can see this over time looking at surveys that were done from the 90s through the 2000s to current time. And this connection, if you have these nationalistic sentiments, you're much more likely to be a Republican today than you would have been in the past. So in the past, there would have been people with nationalistic sentiments who were Democrats, but that's not really true anymore. And so that's obviously also playing a role underneath all of this. If the people in the party who support the party want this kind of nationalistic message, then Donald Trump delivered it to them. They were waiting, they were ready. They were ready for this kind of America first, make America great again, and the sense that we need to play this oversized role in the world, that, other countries are inferior to us, that we're better. And this is the sort of set of questions that are typically asked of people that capture this nationalistic attitude. So again, silly to think that it wasn't just Donald Trump. I mean, that would just be dead wrong. If you, and again, this is what's very helpful to have our big surveys over time conducted with the American population, where we can track the trajectory of these people with these attitudes and what their political preferences are.
I remember when Trump got elected, and about 6 months in, everybody's like, "Oh, can you believe he did this? Can you believe he did that? He's the worst president." I go, he's insulting the press and he's acting like he's stupid and he doesn't care and he's embarrassing us. And I go, like when George W. Bush went on TV and said, "I don't read," and they have no idea what I'm talking about. No who? He said that? Yeah, he went on national TV and said, "I don't read," and he was proud of it. Now, what he meant was, it was dog whistling to his followers. "I don't read those liberal media books like they do. I'm one of you guys." The phrase was, "I don't read." That comes across to the world like we just elected an illiterate. And he was proud of
we
that.
also had, I don't know if you remember, Giuliani gave that speech to the UN soon after 9/11 attacks, and he said, "We don't really need to understand why this happened. We just need to go and get them." So there was that mentality that, these people, we don't care about them very much. Who cares why they did this? We're just out to get them. And this is an anti-intellectual statement, right? Wouldn't it be helpful to understand why this happened? What's underneath this? What is the ideology of these people? We need to get that, right? If we're going to go over there and get them, we need to have a deeper insight. So as an academic, these things are hard to listen to. You think, no, and I think many people felt the same way. We need to know more. We need to understand this better.
When they were telling me, because I had Middle Eastern friends and I knew that, one of my friends was Sikh growing up. It's from India, but still I knew a lot of people. It's California. And they're going, "Oh, they hate us for our freedom." And I'm like, didn't we blow up a lot of countries and bomb a lot of things? Not mentioned at all. They hate us for our freedom. Moving on. That was the debate. That was at the highest levels of the administration and the news parroting that.
I know. I mean, we look back on the Iraq War and think, wow, who thought that the US could just walk in and be treated as heroes and it would all be over in 2 days or whatever the estimates were. You look back on that and think how incredibly naive that was in hindsight. So we did really need to know more about what was going on and what the troops were going to walk into there. So, the American public changed its mind about that eventually, but I think it fueled some of this nationalism, and it made it seem as if the Republican Party was the one who was going to push that sort of agenda.
Fair. Would it be fair to say that when we look at George W. Bush, and we know for a fact that they cherry-picked information, and they didn't actually have information, there was WMDs, they took it from the German intelligence agency, which got it off a guy who was a known drunkard, and then they just passed it through. That's fake news. That was pushed by all the administration officials, and multiple American newspapers, who I think took 2 to 3 years after the Iraq War to eventually apologize, and not even all of them did it. I think New York Times and maybe one other famously apologized, and no one else did it. So we're talking about the rise of fake news. Wouldn't that qualify as fake news pushed by most of the media and most of the federal government? And wouldn't that
the story is now forgotten, but it was pretty shocking because it was clear that some of the stories being advanced were dead wrong, and there was no support for them. I mean, it wasn't a high point for the American news media either. I think we haven't discussed the information environment, but news media is challenged. It's a difficult business. They want eyeballs, or they want readers or subscribers or something. And tragically, wars sell, as does fake news and angry news and bad news. So it is unfortunate. I think the quality of our information environment has really deteriorated over time, making the things we're talking about much more difficult to dive in, get good information, and have people believe you when you say it. I mean, you believe me when I say this, but I can only imagine in some conversations, it would be very hard for me to convince people. I can try and show them data and numbers, and they could accuse me of something else. But I'm a
Uh,
social scientist. I got to live and die by the data itself.
I agree. I was like, Trump started fake news. No, he didn't. The entire federal government with the CIA and the FBI tacitly involving, we're all in it. Fox News started fake news. No, they didn't. Mainstream liberal media did. Sorry, you were all in it. You just want to forget about it. So I'm like, but then I think you pushed it. Nobody apologized. Nobody was punished. Everybody got away with it, which kind of put the signal out there. We can just make stuff up and tell fake news and get away with it. And years later, then you see Fox and Trump pop up. And I'm thinking, maybe if you didn't break the mold, maybe if you didn't put the message out there that you could do this and get away with it, we never would be here. Crazy
Yeah,
thought?
propaganda. I mean, listen, propaganda has been going on for a long time, right? Governments have often employed propaganda in times of war, for example. We know that. And, they'll say, well, it serves the greater purpose. And
Mm-hmm.
so, maybe they'd argue there was a fine line there, that this was in the country's best interests, debatable. But in any event, it was revealed to be a very low point in government information and attempts to manipulate the public, clearly.
I remember in World War II where they said experimenting on African American men with medicines was for the good of the country and we didn't need to tell anybody. And having GIs exposed to nuclear radiation was for the good of the country and we didn't need to tell anybody. And then Vietnam was based on the Gulf of Tonkin, which was fake, but it's for the good of the country and we didn't need to tell anybody. And the draft was aimed at more taking Latinos and young African American males and having them die at a higher rate than Caucasian people, but we didn't need to bring that up for the good of the country. So I'm seeing, wow, sometimes war comes and they make these decisions for the good of the country, and they are horrible, horrible, horrible decisions.
Yeah.
Why should we believe them when they go, well, I did this for the good of the country, like last time and the time before that and the time before that, because you kind of made some boo-boos, right? Like, oh, we lied about the information to get in Iraq for the good of the country. We didn't tell anybody that we had warning signs of 9/11 for the good of the country. At some point, it just seems like garbage. No?
Well, I mean, what I can say is that the public does play a role. So I think part of the problem is, I mean, there are clearly people trying to dig in. Part of the problem today is getting good and accurate information to rely on. Some people feel they're doing great research when in fact all they're being exposed to is fake news.
Thank you.
But it feels as if you're doing your job by checking things out, and it's much more complicated than that. But the truth is, if for example, like we take the Iraq War, eventually the public soured on the war and we pulled out. It was not popular. So collectively, the public can change governmental decision making. Obviously there are elections
Sure.
and you can elect people out, but also arriving at the conclusion that some action was incorrect is enough also for the public to influence government officials.
True.
So, but it's harder for me to see how we get a unified voice on that. We can, these days, if we hope crowdsourcing and the public arrives at the right decision, it can change course. But today we're so divided, it's harder to see those moments when we all come together to decide that something is not good, that the government has made a poor decision.
And I also remember that in the past, we used to punish officials who did things. I mean, Nixon, right? Like he was punished.
Yeah.
Other people would be punished. Now, if you lie to us and you get thousands of American GIs killed for nothing and dismembered, and estimates of 500,000 to 1 million Iraqi civilians, not terrorists, dead by U.S. hands, nobody's punished. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody gets in trouble, and everybody gets away with it. And in fact, the people called the neocons who were pushing the Iraq war still got to stay in government, and they helped push us into Libya and then Ukraine. So we have these bad actors, and they keep acting bad, and nothing ever happens to them. So yeah, you're right. The policies can change, but I wasn't around at the time, but I remember there used to be a time where you don't get to do that to the American public and walk away scot-free, and now that's completely gone. Am I wildly off base in my
Well, we
summary?
still have elections. We still have elections. I mean, look, if and eventually, the Bush administration managed to hang on through the re-election. but support for them dropped and declined dramatically, which led to Obama's election.
True.
So we have these things called elections.
Sure.
And I think the Iraq War played a large role in Obama's election. People were
Absolutely.
very soured on the whole enterprise. So it may be slow, it's messy. I always said democracy is far from perfect. It's what we have.
Sure.
And it
Right.
can
For
work.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't
Listen,
lose that message. I mean, as crazy as things are right now and as polarizing, you hope eventually that, we've got those people in the middle who are trying to size things up.
fair enough.
Maybe they're capable of making a good decision.
Fair enough. And I get it. Democracy's better than totalitarianism or religious government. I certainly don't want to live in Iran or live under, I mean, I want to visit places, but I wouldn't want to live there. China, Russia, want to visit, don't want to stay. But our democracy now is not as much quality as we had in the 60s and 70s. Again,
Right.
we used to hold officials to account and they used to be punished, and nothing like that happens today. So we're already dealing with a qualitatively less quality democracy and going, well, it's still a democracy. Isn't there some point where our democracy becomes like a failed Latin American democracy where we call it a democracy, but it's really totalitarianism, like maybe Colombia and a couple other countries where
Look,
who's really
here's
going to
what I'd say
win?
about that. I mean, our democratic norms are pretty strong. We have had some erosion around the edges. And we would say that that's happening at the level of local voting, that there have been strange procedures to eliminate people from the electoral rolls. There are violations. We have gerrymandering of our congressional districts that can skew results. So we have a lot of things that are not necessarily anti-democratic, but potentially weakening our democracy.
Right.
But Americans, when you ask them questions about democracy, hold strong. I mean, they can say, well, for immediate short-term advantage, maybe we should gerrymander because that will help us win the next election. But if you say, well,
Sure.
once the other side gets into power, they could do the same thing to you, it's a helpful reminder that it isn't just a tit. Democracy is not just a tit for tat. It's a set of underlying principles. And compared to other countries, our history is strong and long. People are outraged. I think it's fair to say that after the January 6th events, there was a lot of souring on that. People soured on Trump. We could see it in the polls. The diehard supporters are still there, but others peeled away from him. It is not an American thing to think, yes, let's just overthrow our government willy-nilly. It's really not okay. And people are still very willing to live by these rules and regulations and abide by the outcome of democratic elections. So we are not we are not a country. You look at Eastern Europe, you can say many of the countries that have fallen into more of a totalitarian state, like Hungary, or perhaps like Turkey, have a weak history, have a weak democratic history. So at the moment, I think we can say that there's no evidence that general support for these principles is eroding. I mean,
Sure.
there's fraying around the edges, and especially if you couch it in terms of, I can score some points for the next election. That might help my side. But I think what we have to do is remind people, yes, that's today. But if we continue down this path, unless you think you're just going to grab the whole thing, it's going to hurt you the next round, or could.
Fair.
So I think, so I think there's no evidence yet that American democracy is, on the trash heap. I
Okay.
think that's a vast overstatement.
So when people say, let's get rid of the filibuster so that we can pass all our legislation through, who cares if it pisses off 49% of the country? That's upholding democratic norms?
Imagine you were living in a parliamentary democracy. That would certainly be the case. I mean, the filibuster is an unusual aspect of our democracy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's in a minority holding. It could be a minority holding or a slim majority impeding the minority. There are different rules in different democracies.
Sure.
And we could say, well, that, in other places that could be quite democratic. Why don't we just let, 51% prevail? So the filibuster, but on the other hand, it might be the, protection of some other right. So, and, it's a convention more than anything. And it could, we can imagine it's within bounds within our system to get rid of it. It doesn't undermine American democracy.
True. Well, true, but the idea of I won this election, but then the next election the other person could win and do things, that doesn't seem to me to be reflected by people who are saying let's get rid of the filibuster. If you do that, you're going to have laws just rocket right through the House and the Senate, and then you get Trump and president, and they're going to be abortion gone, machine guns totally legal, and then the next person gets elected. Abortions totally legal everywhere. Machine guns not elected. That's what's going to happen if we get rid of the filibuster. It's going to be massive flops. That doesn't seem to say, I recognize that I might lose next election. A lot of people are pushing for that over here. That just doesn't seem to suggest that.
And we haven't seen it. Biden is not supportive of that. So I think there are Democrats who realize this could come back to bite us.
True, but there's a lot of Democrats pushing it and a lot of Republicans pushing it when it's their time. And additionally, we also had, after January 6th, I remember the Republican Party condemned it, and then they walked it back. And while the percentage of people at January 6th was small, the Republicans are technically, I think, quasi-control of the House and sort of control of the Senate. That's not small. And they literally, as a party, walked back their condemnation of January 6th. That can't be seen as good for democracy. The other thing that gets me is I don't recall, because I'm Mexican, and I asked my grandma, why are we here? And why are so many Mexicans in America? And she goes, well, because America invaded every single Latin American country and destabilized them. So I started studying democracy in Latin American countries at age 18, got my first subscription to Foreign Affairs magazine. Only 18-year-old who got that. They do a lot of, oh, you lost an election? Now I'm going to investigate you and lock you up. Oh, did you think you won an election? I'll just tell all my supporters you didn't for the next 4 years. That's happening here now. That used to only exclusively.
It hasn't happened. Let's admit that it hasn't actually happened. There were attempts, and it came close. If that had, so we don't know. Like if that were to happen, I think it really does raise the legitimacy of our democracy if we can just overturn the outcome of a popular vote. That really does seem, and with at the federal level, acknowledging the role of the Electoral College, but if we overturn and just say no, we're annulling this, we're in deep trouble at that point. And
totally
it could have happened.
Totally
but who knows what? But we don't know what would have happened afterwards. We have institutions, and we're not quite sure what would have occurred at that point. It could have been deeply problematic, but let's hope we don't have to go there.
I agree. It just, if you go back 10, 15 years ago and you go in the future in America, when someone's elected, the other side's going to say, I don't believe it for the next 4 years. People would go, that's nuts. And now we're here. The Democrats did it for 4 years with Russiagate, true to not be true. They don't want to hear that. Obviously, the Republicans were lying about the stop the steal the thing. But so that's both parties saying, I kind of have a story that I like that says you didn't win. And I'm really just going to hold on to it, despite what your facts are. The Durham report came out. I've tried finding any liberal or any Democrat who will corroborate what it says. I can't find anybody. And it's a federal investigation. And what it says is the Democrats did not play fair. And nobody really wants to hear that. Nobody really wants to criticize them. I've been around 46 years. Old. I don't recall in the past where we had somebody go, I lost an election. My goal now is to lock you up. I lost an election. My goal now is to get everyone on my party to deny that you even won. That seems categorically new and scary.
No, it's scary. There's no question. I think if we were to rate American democracy, it's slipping. There's no question. And this belief, this widespread belief that Biden did not win the election is really deeply problematic. Now, people still seem to be abiding. He is president, and people seem to be abiding by this and going along with things, and we will have another election. So I think it's very important for these institutions to hold, right? We'll see what happens. We're concerned about what's going on at the state level, some with state elected officials who are harassed, but we need them to hold the line, and some of them are. Thankfully, we have some very upstanding people who are running elections around the country, but some of them have been subject to death threats. That's really, I think, under radar. That's deeply problematic. These elected officials are being targeted by people harassing them. Some people have survived attempts on their lives. It's really disturbing. True.
And I am disgusted by that, and it was wrong, and they never should have done that. But I also recall when we were told, Donald Trump wasn't elected by the American public. The Russian government rigged the entire election and put him in there. And they massively switched votes. They literally got hacked into the computers and, oh, did you vote for, you voted for Trump. That's why he's in. Bill Maher is a famous television personality here in California. He literally went on TV and said, you weren't elected by us. We know it was by the Russian government, and we're going to wait till then. 3-4 years later, it comes out, not true, according to a federal investigation. I can't find any liberal who goes, we shouldn't have done that. That was kind of not a good look for the country. Not good. No one. So now we have two sides doing it. That's got to be bad, right?
Well, I think the weaponizing of democracy is an area that we have to really look at much more closely. Both sides claim it's democratic, right? So everyone's talking democracy. And they independently believe they're upholding democracy. So somehow we have to figure out how to get around that. But it is very problematic. Once we think we've taken, 85% of us have taken some side to varying degrees and are inclined to believe one or the other side of that story. So this is, we haven't really talked about, again, it's back to how do we get an independent news voice? How do people get information that is credible and believable? Social media has definitely not helped with this. And part of the problem is the kind of things that get retweeted or spread around in social media tend to be angry, moralistic messages. And so when people are exposed to things, they're hearing the worst. They're hearing the most vitriolic, angry, accusatory tales that you could possibly pass around. And this, again, is partly to shore up their credentials as a good partisan. So, it's hard to know, how do we break that information problem? I mean, that's where we're at. It's very hard to think, what is a credible news source now for a lot of people?
It is. I remember when the federal government came out under Biden they were going to come out with a fact-checking administration, Mina Jankowicz or something like that. And right after they announced it, people were pulling up tweets from her where she peddled misinformation. And they're like, and this is the person who the federal government vetted and said, here's our fact checker for the feds. Oh, whoops. Did she?
Well, I mean, look, fact checking, but it's just even having some kind of, news source that we could say, this is, in fact, an independent voice of information. I mean, the fact checking after the fact doesn't really work. If you tell people, hey, we fact checked it, and they still tend to believe it. So it's really the initial dissemination of the information that's incredibly important. Right. And a lot of that is social. Once you believe, if I say this in a group, people are going to yell at me. That's right. A strong motivation for not saying it, right? If someone says, oh, that's just claptrap from the left or the same from the right, then people are going to shut you down.
We need a independent, fair news station that everyone agrees to. That's the facts, right?
Certainly, when we wrote the Iraq, so thinking back, I know, hopping back to the Iraq War, why? I don't know, but anyway, going back to the Iraq War.
That's how I got involved in politics, by the way. So talk as much as you want.
Yeah, no, but at that time, it was sort of, that's what I'm saying, the 90s, 2000s was sort of the beginning of the end. Back then, about 50% of households around the time of 9/11, so 2001, 50% got a newspaper delivered to the home. And that would have delivered uniform news to, let's say it was, your state newspaper. That meant 50% of the households in the state were getting the same news. And they might have got it for the sports or whatever, but they'd see the news on the front page and be exposed to that. Or we had network television stations. I mean, we've lost all of that uniformity.
We had an agreed upon set of facts. Maybe I have a different opinion of you of what to do with those facts, but we acknowledge an apple is red and it tastes like a piece of fruit.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's gone. That's gone with the news media. That's gone with the social media. Can we get it back? I've heard a lot of opinions about that. Ooh, that's not a good. I like how you looked away when I answered that. Yeah, I've heard some professors say, I said, the media's constantly saying, oh, we're politically polarized. Let's just pass a law to rein in the social media companies and the news corporations and bring back the fairness doctrine, and poof, everything will be fixed instantaneously. Does that sound realistic to you, Professor?
I mean, not at the moment. It's certainly not at the moment, and
Why
it's
not?
hard to imagine. I think, look, what I do think is that social, doing something about social media. So maybe the collapse of things like Twitter or changes with Twitter will help, um, possibly to stop. Some of it is this, just the ease with which this information can spread among and like a group of like-minded people. So it's where the news originates and how it's spread. So a lot of people don't even know where they get their news from anymore. They'll just say, I get my news from Facebook, let's say. And you're like, well, Facebook is not a news organization.
Right.
So where is that news coming from? People don't really know. So I think there are efforts afoot to try and educate our younger generation, people, college age people, about how to decode news. Possible. I'm not sure how well that would work, but at least start asking, what's the source of the news? How credible is it? How do I figure that out? People describe them as sort of media literacy skills, news media literacy skills, and it wouldn't hurt to have them. Because I think for a lot of people, they're just getting information that they take at face value without ever scrutinizing where it's coming from. But you have to be in a group of people that also reward that sort of thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
So
that's the issues. As I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, the news corporations and the social media companies didn't do this because they said, we want to divide America. They did it because their corporation's out to make profits. And they realized if you have somebody gets on there and says something outrageous and everybody's upset, advertising revenue just showering down. And so I remember having a couple conversations with professors, and I said, so the solution is to convince these corporations to not do the thing that made them record profits. Is that it? And they go, well, yeah. And I go, how are we going to do that when under US law, a corporation has only one goal, which is to increase the profits for its shareholders? So they literally can't do anything other than that, according to the law. So how are we going to do that when the law says you can't do it, and when it's against the very nature of a corporation, which is to make profit? How would we do that?
So I think, again, it's a two-way street. Why is it profitable? Because people do it. We're
Sure.
humans. This goes back to
Yeah.
the psychology where we started. Again, there are different motives for spreading this kind of information, but one is to show I'm a good Democrat, I'm a good Republican. This goes back to my identity. I want to demonstrate to you that I fit in here, that you should like me. So this is our other problem, that we want to be liked. We find ourselves in these like-minded communities and want to show that we fit in and that we belong there. So we want this sense of belonging. So it's unfortunate that profit has come about and capitalized on some of our tendencies. So how can you wind it back? I mean, I think, some of it is trying to get back to some media literacy skills. I know that people are talking about that. It's a hard fight, because if I want to say on social media, you should value me, I want you to like me, I want you to think that I'm a great person, and if I spread this information, you're going to think I'm amazing.
Right.
That's a hard contest with, I want to be a good citizen and think accurately and spread the right kind of information. That's our dilemma right now. And it's interesting that, I'm doing some research right now with one of my graduate students, trying to get people to think, okay, is this message that you're being exposed to accurate? And sometimes people know it's not, and they still spread it, and they still say,
Thank
sure,
you.
that's fine. I know it's wrong. I'm doing it for different reasons. I'm doing it for these social reasons. I'm doing it to show that I'm a really loyal, good Democrat or Republican, and that other people are going to like me more, and they're going to, like me, retweet my stuff. It's going to spread more. I'm going to become, more prominent if I purvey this sort of information. So it's really a tough fight. And you can sort of help people try and understand that, analyze it a little more, help them with the psychology of all of this to underscore how that's deleterious. But, just reminding people are trying all sorts of things like, oh, wake up, is this accurate? And that doesn't seem to make that much difference. Some researchers find it makes some difference. But in the research that we've been doing, no, it's all about trying to show that you're a good Democrat or Republican.
Identity.
And I'm
Identity.
willing to share it for identity reasons.
Identity comes before factual information. And that's where we're at today. I totally agree with that. I have a lot of friends who don't like me anymore because I have this habit of going, I'm sorry, that's a fact. Look, I don't like the guy either, but this is a fact. And that just gets me no friends at all.
Yeah. Right.
Like when I say, look, I don't like Trump. I think he's a racist. I think he's a bad guy. We did have a trade imbalance with China, and he was the first president to tackle that. If I just say that, you must secretly like him. I can't hang out with you anymore. And I go, I just said the guy's a racist and I don't like it. I just said on this one specific thing, it's technically correct. Whose side are you on? Immediately. And I go, I'm on the side of facts. That does nothing to convince anybody to listen at all. And that's on both sides.
So that's the other thing. Like maybe, I mean, and you are absolutely right. This is rampant.
These are smart, educated people doing this.
Yeah, it's rampant. And it really is. It's all about identity. Whereas, what I always say is that we're in this defensive frame of mind. I've got to defend this. And the trick is to think, how do I decrease this defensiveness and get you to listen to what I'm saying? So we may need to practice our discussion and debate skills. Remember when we used to debate? Kids would learn debating skills in school, and where you would take different sides and just argue them to understand them, even if you didn't agree with them. And I think we've lost the ability to have dispassionate conversations like that where I'm not putting myself on the line. This goes back to all of this sorting. It's who I am. It's my identity. Everything is rolled up into one. And if that's at stake in every conversation, it's a problem, because you're just going to toe the party line and you're not going to be able to take on board contradictory information.
And even if you know it's bad information, you might still push it anyways.
Yeah, especially, let me say this, especially in that kind of setting. I mean, if I'm in a social media setting, I can't let my guard down. I have to, even if I know it's wrong, I'm doing it for some other purpose.
Yeah, I remember saying, so right after the 2016 election with Trump, where they said Russia hacked the election, which wasn't exactly true, but they didn't tell us 3 to 4 years later. About a year after that, there was a story that Russia hacked a power grid in, I think, New Hampshire and shut it down. And then you had Bernie Sanders and another major elected official go on Twitter and just start saying, oh my God, here's the Russians attacking again. Totally false, not based upon anything at all. You had other major network reporters also pick up that story and tweet on it. After it came out to be false, they said, I don't really want to take down the tweet. It kind of makes me look stupid. So I'm just going to keep stuff I know that wasn't accurate up because it looks bad for Trump. And I don't want to make it look like Trump actually won anything. We can't give him a win on anything at all. So I need to keep this fake news up so that it doesn't look like we actually make mistakes when we report on Trump. And they did that. And it's famous. They just wouldn't take it down. And I go, this is fake news. You're pushing fake news. You know it's fake news. Your job is to admit that it's fake news and correct it. And none of you will do that.
We have this, we have some of this asymmetry also in social science, where some people will argue it's all on the problems are all on the conservative side. But I've always argued that these things are symmetrical. Your diehard Democrats act just like the diehard Republicans. It's the same dynamic. And my Democratic friends never want to hear this. But when we look at how they react to threats and so on, and whether they're in this defensive frame of mind and downgrade contradictory but factual information, there's a little bit of evidence that there may be more spreading of fake news on the Republican side. I think there's growing evidence of that. Maybe it's the supply, that there's more supply, but it's also the case that there is a slight tendency. But in other matters, Democrats are just inclined towards this kind of defensive reasoning, as are Republicans. And this wins you no friends either. By saying this is my research, I try to explain to my friends, this is my research. I'm telling you about what I found. Oh, well, and so it is
Thank
difficult
you.
to
I'm
even
just going to
convince your
bow.
friends.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Almost no one will say that.
I'm a social scientist. Like I'm just, we get a bad rap, but the truth is, if you're in the business that I'm in, we have data. We collect information from people, and our job is to report what we see. Without we don't cook the. You can't really. It's very hard to cook the books. I could not report something, but and I learn a lot personally by looking at this kind of survey data. It teaches me a great deal about the public, and I look at how things go together. It's actually a very fascinating enterprise, but you can't make it up. It is what it is. These are the numbers. This is what people believe. My theoretical stance is that once we develop these identities, it does generate this desire to defend, to be part of the group, to belong, to be well regarded by other people in the same political grouping.
I saw an article on polarization. I forget what the title was, but basically it was saying you might think that really educated people are better at this, and they're not. They fall into identity too, and they don't need to double check their sources because they're sure they're right, and they push it. So there's really no difference between the educated and uneducated as far as pushing fake news. Once you get into this identity loop, don't go, oh, well, all they need is a good college education, and no, that's not true.
Unless we can teach people these skills, which is, people resist this when I say you're in a defensive frame of mind, but I think deep down they probably know that they are. And so the question is, how do you practice getting out of that? Again, debating was the way we used to do it. Okay, take the other side and give it your best and explain why they believe these things. And there are some people working on this. In social science parlance, we might call it perspective taking. So it's to try and adopt the viewpoint of another person to see it from their side. And people are trying to engage in this sort of exercise to decrease partisan polarization. But it doesn't come naturally. And we're often in these combative situations talking about politics. We immediately get into combat. And that just increases this desire to defend as opposed to think carefully about the arguments that are being made. So it's good practice. I mean, look, if people can just for a moment shut it down and say, let me listen to this. Let's pull it apart. Let's see if it stands up to logical scrutiny. Then we would be better off if we could practice this kind of debate skill.
I agree. As it goes right now, I'll go, well, here's a fact. Where'd you get that note from? Fox? I don't need to listen to anything you say. Where'd you get that from? MSNBC? I don't need to listen to anything you say. I just the moment you say the source, it better be from my side. But both of those channels cherry pick the information they show. And the only way anybody's going to listen is if you can go, you're an MSNBC viewer, right? MSNBC themselves admitted this. That's the only way I can find people to go, okay, now I'll listen to your facts. But MSNBC and Fox work really hard to cherry pick their information. For example, Fox did not go, hey, the stop the steal thing is all fake, folks. It's just a lie. It's a fake. The guy hates losing. I never saw MSNBC or CNN go, look, I know for the last 4 years we said Russia installed Trump. Turns out it's not true. No one does that. Neither side. So it's hard. It's hard to get them to do that. And I remember we used to talk debate. I went to debate school, and I remember it was a very, very difficult assignment to debate both sides.
It doesn't come very naturally. That's part of the problem, I think, for humans. It's very easy for us to just glom on to what our group thinks, right? I mean, it eases our social discussions. It makes us feel like we belong. And as you said, even very well-trained thinkers like academics will have these beliefs, and it's easier to keep those beliefs. So there's a high bar for any information that challenges it. We subject that naturally to more scrutiny, which is good, not wrong. But humans are not great at this. As I was saying, it's much more comfortable for us to defend our identities. This is something we're very accustomed to doing.
Yeah, tribal. I think it was a
I
little
mean,
like
it's just part of where I would say we're social animals. We
we
depend on
are.
each other.
We
We depend
are.
on each
Uh,
other.
I want to come back to this. I want to ask you a question. So I have seen professors publish on political science, and it goes like this. Yeah, the left moved a little bit to the left, but really 90% of the problem is all the right. And or they would look at a bunch of data and they would show the data, but then they would go, we don't really need to look at the data. Come on, guys, you know it's the Republicans, right? I've seen two different major reporters professionally say that in published material. Is that a good sign to bring everybody together, or does that suggest bias as a professor?
I mean, you need to look at the evidence. I mean, there is some evidence. So just taking on that point, I think Alan Abramowitz had done this, looking at the U.S. Congress, taking objective standards of what was conservative and liberal, and looking at Republicans and Democrats, how they voted. And there was no question that through the 90s, the right became more right.
Sure.
The left has become more left more recently. But, so we have to be able to look at, these are just their votes. It's what they voted
Sure.
on, and coding sort of the extremity of the liberal or conservative stances that were being adopted. So we need some way. This is what social scientists do. We try to come up with an agreed upon way to measure and assess things. Now that's harder for someone in the general public to be able to scrutinize, and we debate methods a lot of the time. That's a whole other thing. But we do have an agreed upon way, and things won't get published in good journals if they're shoddy.
Oh, it was good
So,
research. It's just, personal comments mixed in towards the end.
and the kind of journals that I publish in, there's no place for that. It's not my
Okay.
opinion. I'm reporting on information.
I've seen it twice in two major, well-established people who study this field. I won't name
Yeah.
them, but if I name the names, you know exactly who I was talking about. And the question is weird because let's say it is mostly the people on the right and it's a little bit of the left move to the left. But talking with you, you go, everybody's doing this identity formation, fake news, my side,
Mhm.
which means liberals and Democrats have as much retraining as conservatives and Republicans if we're actually going to fix America. Is that
Sure.
fair?
Yeah, I think that's it's a fair statement. We all have to check our biases. We all have to say, I think I was saying that just towing the line, I really need to think about this more deeply, or let me look into the information, rather than just reflexively saying no. So, it's a good exercise to undertake is whenever you see a piece of information, think, what would the objections be? Can I defend this?
Right.
If I had to stand up and defend it, can I? Or am I just saying this because everyone else is saying it?
A lot of people are smart. They have a lot of good data, but I've heard from many professors that almost everybody in the field who studies political science in America is a Democratic voter or doesn't vote Republican. And that seems to suggest some bias. There's professors like Corey Clark and Lee Jessam who outright seem to suggest that. And when I see professors who are considered top of the line in the field do a bunch of great information and then just throw a little tidbit comment there at the end of, come on, we know it's really them, guys. I'm thinking, is this how we get America healed? Because if conservatives saw that, they would automatically reject that journal and
Yeah,
any
and
of the studies
look,
in
and
it.
I think in political science, it is more difficult if once you're data based, once you're dealing with information like survey of public opinion and so on. I can't make it up. I mean, it is whatever it is, and I'm trying to understand. My goal is to see the patterns in this, whether they're psychological patterns in terms of what people believe, why they get angry, whatever it is. I'm just trying to sort it out. And, I could be just as subject to critique as anyone else, but I really try to do my job. I mean, I really am. I'm not trying to take sides. I might have my own side, but that's irrelevant to what I'm doing in terms of my social science work. So, I think most of my colleagues have those high standards. We read each other's work. We'll say, no, you haven't convinced me. This is no good. I don't buy it. I want more evidence along these lines. That's what we do. So I don't know, people may be writing in
Sure.
other forums and other settings where there's more room for their opinions. But when I'm writing an article about data, I can't really stray from that information.
Yeah. One was a published book by a well-respected author. Another was a presentation by 2 or 3 top respected officials, and one person added in it the comment. And the other one was a book I just read where they were talking about polarization in America. And they said, well, there was the debt ceiling with Obama and the Tea Party. And the Tea Party was pretty radical, and they pushed this debt ceiling to the first time, like we didn't pay off our debts and it was very bad for the economy. And they go, and this is because the Tea Party's radical. And then they moved on. The fact is that the World Bank itself issued a very famous letter at that moment blaming both Obama and the Tea Party, saying you're both polarized and you both can't work together. That was completely omitted from the book. Tea Party did it all. Obama did nothing wrong. Moving on. And I'm going, I remember the World Bank said Obama too. And that was not mentioned in this.
Well, look, in my experience, the people that I work with try very hard to accurately assess the data that they're dealing with. Maybe in a book, there's a moment to, provide a personal assessment, but I'm talking about data-driven social science, which is when we're really looking, and that's largely what I do, is I, study public opinion. I try to look at it from that standpoint. It tells me whether I'm right or wrong.
Fair enough.
I can't do much about it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let me ask you a question on the strength of American democracy. You're saying, yeah, we got some problems, but there's institutions, and the institutions are strong. I've talked to a couple of professors, and they say, on the one hand, political polarization now is not as bad as it was in the 1960s, the 1890s, the 1920s. You had more people killed, more violence, certainly in the 1960s, and that's bad. We don't have that yet. Hopefully we don't. But those same professors would say it's absolutely worse now than then, because back then people had common faith in institutions, and today they don't. And what they're pointing out is the lowest amount of faith of the Supreme Court, the Congress, the presidency, and pretty much every federal office in the last 40 years. We actually have people saying, I won't do what the Supreme Court says. And we have people saying, I don't listen to your elections and I don't follow it. Support for almost every federal branch, except for the military, is the lowest it's been in about half a century. Does that mean we can survive this period like we did in the 1960s?
We'll find out. I think people say that there's a lot of negativity about institutions in general. For example, Congress. Everyone hates Congress, right? But they love their representative. So, we have to take these assessments with a grain of salt. Does it mean that people won't follow rules and regulations? I think that's more debatable. I think we just get, a lot of institutions get a bad rap. Bad news sells. It's easy to condemn the U.S. Congress, hopeless losers, but we do like our representative. So this has always been something of a contrast. I don't think it's that bad. I think that people are still following the rules. They're still paying their taxes to whatever extent they are. There's a high bar to overthrow or to just reject the rules that we've developed in our society. Again, it goes back to our social nature, that we are reasonably obedient. We do follow rules. In moments of great crisis, people will contravene those, but it goes against a lot of what we would do as part of our routine behavior. So I'm a bit dubious. People will say things like this in surveys. What it actually means, I think we need to investigate more fully with some further questioning in these surveys.
Pew Research has been studying this for 4 decades, and they have shown a consistent trend. So that's Pew Research.
Look, it may be, but the bottom line is behavior, right? We can say that there is an erosion of support. The question is how far it goes. And just because we don't respect it doesn't mean that we don't follow the rules in our actual behavior. That's a higher bar.
True.
But can I just ask you, I'm sorry, Max, can I ask you, I have another meeting.
I'll ask you one.
Sorry, I thought it was about an hour. I thought we were having an hour.
Oh, sure. We'll just end it there.
Okay.
I really appreciate your time.
Okay. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you for coming out. I'll send you a copy of the video in a few hours, and I really appreciate your time. And if you know anybody else, I hope you found this was a fair interview. I wasn't trying to trick you or anything.
Yes.
You know anybody else who might be interested in being interviewed, we would love to talk to them.
Okay. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. Bye.